Great to be with you all. We are going to present a little bit of the data first. It wouldn't be a McKinsey keynote without some data to stimulate some discussion. And then we'll invite Claudia and Katy both to be in dialogue about that data from the McKinsey perspective, and Katy is our Chief People Officer, and so really we'll talk about how McKinsey actually aspires to be a people and performance leader. And then Claudia, who is the Chief People Officer and also the Head of Sustainability at Xylem, and I'll talk a little bit more about your bio before we get into the panel. We'll bring it to life in terms of her context as well. But first we'll go into the data and walk that through, and Katy and I will lead through that discussion.
Great, it's really a pleasure to be here. I think, like many of you, I found the play yesterday to be incredibly thought-provoking, very deeply so. At McKinsey, we have a dual mission, and I think, like many of you, people is at kind of the center of our mission. And we tell ourselves that when we invest in people and help them to be, really exceptional and great, it has great returns for our clients, right? They end up having the benefit of all of this talent, and they have great impact. And when we have great client impact, that creates even more development opportunities for our people. But sometimes it feels inauthentic. And does it have to be inauthentic? Is that actually inauthentic? I think that was the question that was really raised for me in the play yesterday, and probably for all of us. Can we really have both? Or is that impossible? And we live in such an interesting moment. I think we all have roles that are just, to me, I feel like we're in this historic moment that we have the privilege of being in the people space, in the culture space, because there are a lot of mixed messages coming right now. Only 2 months ago, I was at Davos, and there was a lot of conversation about talent and hybrid, and somebody said, the war for talent is over, talent won. And yet we're now in this position of saying, well, is the pendulum swinging back? And should we let it swing back? There are a lot of senior leaders who would love to see the pendulum swing back. Let's go back to how it was. Did we overdo it during COVID around all of this pastoral care that we were providing and all this mental health support and all of this kind of flexibility that we were providing? Is that really the right way to go? And yet, I think, we see this interesting moment where the pendulum may be swinging back if you look at the numbers of layoffs, but I don't know about you, we thought, oh, this might be a great opportunity to bring even more great talent in. That's not so easy, right? There is a permanent change, really, I think, in workforce expectations. So we've looked at this from a data perspective, as Brooke said. We did research, and some of you may know our Organizational Health Index, which is research that companies use to look at their practices and to look at whether they're internally consistent kind of practices around leadership that drive culture and performance. And previously through this work, we found that organizational health does drive financial returns. And we've also shown that companies that really invest in human capital provide better earnings outcomes for their employees. But we wanted to go further. And so with this work, we asked additional questions. How does investing in people translate into the bottom line? Does it? Does investing in people translate to the bottom line? And if so, what are the kind of investments, what are the kind of practices that lead to this kind of dual outcome around human capital outcomes, people being happier, more productive, et cetera, but also more fulfilled, but also bottom line impact for companies. So what we did is we looked at 1,800 companies around 15 different countries. So this is not a US kind of focused analysis. It truly is a global analysis across all different sectors. We looked at companies that were over $100 million in revenue per year. And we looked at a whole set of financial returns, just looking at companies' balance sheets and financial reports. But we also looked at a lot of ESG metrics and human capital metrics. And what we found is that, in fact, there are some winners here in the top right quadrant who are able to both win on our people metrics and also win on bottom line performance. And I think all of us kind of sense that. We probably all have micro examples where we can see that in action. I do a lot of work in manufacturing, and what we've learned is the companies that are able to go from kind of hype around digital manufacturing to real impact with returns, clear returns on investment, are the ones that have really invested in workforce engagement and upskilling. That's the difference. It's about human capital investment, and workforce reports from those companies are that their satisfaction has gone way up and is much higher than the companies that have tried to just automate using digital tools. We see that at McKinsey as well when we look at our teams that are the happiest, that have the fastest personal growth, that say that they have the best mentorship and sponsorship, the best apprenticeship. They have higher retention. They also have the highest client feedback scores around client impact. So we see this, but now we actually have looked at this at a much meta kind of data level, and we have real data around this. And you can see these 4 quadrants that companies pretty neatly divided into. You see on the top left that there are companies that have just as good performance, bottom line performance, as the ones on the top right. And it's actually much easier to be in that group. 20% of our group were top performers from an earnings perspective, but they were not also great performance on the people side. And then you see on the bottom right, companies that really invested in human capital, did all these wonderful things about culture and training, et cetera, inclusion, but actually were not also developing great performance. So you can see these 4 quadrants, which are quite distinguishable, and I'll show you a bit more data. But what you see in the top right is really a wonderful kind of magic set of outcomes in that they absolutely show more consistent earnings. They show more resilience. That's probably not surprising to us because, of course, it's the people who make companies resilient. They retain talent, and they're able to build much greater scale. Employees are more upwardly mobile, and they report better work environments. So I'll show you a little bit more data, and then Brooke's going to talk a little bit about what the practices are that we see for these companies in this top right. So here's some of the data that really shows how these different companies or how these different segments are different from each other. So what's interesting, I think, is if you look at the first 2, right, the ones with great performance returns, you can see basically the same in terms of economic profit and revenue. You can see the same returns on invested capital, and you can see that those first 2 columns really are standouts relative to the second 2 columns. But then if you look at the bottom 2 rows, that's where you start seeing some real differences in how companies are getting to that kind of performance. So you see internal moves as a % of all moves. So basically, how much internal mobility are these companies creating, filling jobs internally versus externally. And there you see a huge difference in the first column versus the second. And similarly, the number of training hours, huge difference in the first versus the second. So this is a really stark difference in how companies are achieving top performance. And what we're seeing is that these top performers in the first column are more resilient and more scaled than the ones in the second column. We also see that the employees in this first group, not surprisingly, there's a lot more investment in these folks, and you see that paying off in terms of their own earnings potential. So you see that employees are much more upwardly mobile in the top group than in the others. And this is a really interesting one. We looked at attrition, and we said, okay, if you look at the left one is from 2017 to 2019, right, pre-pandemic, what was happening in terms of attrition? And you see this very interesting U-curve where the people-focused and either the people-focused only or the people and performance winners had much lower attrition than the other companies who were at completely different ends of the spectrum in terms of earnings. But what happened after, oops, sorry, no problem. But what happened during the pandemic? Because did that all go out the window as attrition rose for everybody? Well, attrition did rise for everybody, but it rose much more for the companies on either side of that spectrum. And so the difference between, again, the performance drivers only and the people and performance drivers is quite stark. And then this is an exciting one. It shows just how we talk about superstar companies as being in the top 10% of their sectors. And you can see that the people and performance winners are much more likely to have achieved that superstar status than any of the other any of the other segments. And not surprisingly, when you look at what employees say about working in these environments, you can see that there's, again, a big difference between the people and performance winners than the others. And these are starting to get into kind of what is going on underneath the covers here. What are the different practices? And I'm going to hand over to Brooke in a second, and she's going to talk more about the practices. But you can see gender pay gap being the lowest in the people and performance winners of any of the segments. You can see childcare support being the highest. And you can see also the commitment to employee resource groups or affinity groups, et cetera. So these are really stark differences in what investments companies are making in their workforce that you saw the kind of returns. So I think some of these things are very intuitive to this particular audience, but now we have some data that's very, very compelling.
Great. So hopefully you're convinced on the fact base now. Let's go into, how to make it happen. What are these organizations doing to be people and performance winners? And if you think about human capital accumulation over time, of course, there's some foundational things that happen at an early stage of one's development, right? And then we get into formal schooling, right? And there's some great innovation happening around how to assess formal schooling and not just using degrees and more formal ways, but actually, skills-based hiring. And there's actually some people in the room here today who are doing a lot of innovative thinking on that front. But then you move into human capital as accumulated through your work experience. And what we see in the data is that organizations that at the same time get the most out of an individual's human capital, but also add to that human capital, have an extra layer of support, an extra layer of organizational capital that they're adding in, right? So what helps a person apply their human capital in an organizational context? Well, one, they need to have some basic tools. So that's the physical capital at the bottom. They maybe need to have an office. They need to have a place to work. They need to have a computer, right? Then you go a step above that, and you go into other intangible capital, right? So these would be the things that help you further accelerate and activate your human capital. Maybe it's the brand of the company you work for. It gives you a bigger stage. Maybe it's the data and the analytics that you have access to. But then there's this organizational capital. Think of this as how the organization runs itself, the management practices that set the context in which an individual employee can really use their human capital and put it to work. And if you look at that organizational capital layer and you distill what is happening in terms of that organizational capital, there are a couple of different features of people and performance winners that stand out. Let me actually first talk about the performance-driven companies, and then I'll go to the talent or the people-focused companies, and then kind of bring it together. So on the performance-driven companies, not surprisingly, you're going to see a very clear vision, right? You're going to see the company having a strategic clarity in terms of what it seeks to do. You're going to have clear performance goals, a focus on efficiency, and then, of course, an external orientation, shaping customers, having awareness of the competitive context. Now, if you look at talent or people-focused companies, you're going to see transparent performance contracts. You're going to see a real ability to support entrepreneurship and have employees feel supported in that context around initiative taking. And then you're going to have, of course, on-the-job training and coaching, right? So kind of classic development levers. Now, the interesting thing about the people and performance winners is they take some of those, or rather all of those people-focused practices, but they do a little bit different, something different at the top when it comes to performance. They spend more time translating that shared vision into an individual's world, right? What we would call a link between strategic clarity and role clarity. And they empower employees in that context, right? With really helping them understand what is their role relative to that strategy. And that helps to foster ownership, right? Alignment with the vision. It actually helps to create ownership for driving innovation, right? At the bottom of the organization, right? This concept of bottom-up innovation and collaboration. And these organizations, and Katy mentioned this in the data, also do something that the other two quadrants don't do. They foster an inclusive work environment, and they invest in measures that would help promote inclusion. So diversity isn't good enough for these companies. They go further, and they promote inclusion of the diverse talent. So these are some of the practices that we're seeing these people and performance winners really emphasize in terms of the data. And I want to show you how that translates into potential policies and leadership behaviors at an organization level. So at a company-wide policy perspective, you have performance management, right? So a good practice would be, of course, having a clear performance contract. I understand my expectations, right? A great company would have very clear differentiation in terms of consequences, good and bad for performances, with clear linkages to incentives, right? Again, this is not all negative. This is also giving upside to those very top performers. In terms of talent development, any good organization is going to have a clear strategic workforce planning strategy. But what a really great organization will do, a people and performance winner, is actually think not just about the ready-to-work talent, but the ready-to-learn talent, right? The ready-to-grow talent. And they will foster ways in which that talent can grow and thrive in the organization. It's related to this point of having more internal mobility in an organization that is a people and performance winner. I mentioned in work environment, it's not just diversity. We're going to hear a lot more about that today, but a focus on inclusion practices, right, to really activate that diversity. And then you see some interesting things happening too here in terms of these people and performance winners in terms of leadership behaviors. So you see, like I said, when we looked at the practices, the translation of that shared vision, that strategic clarity, into role-specific implications. And when you walk in, to a company that is a people and performance winner, you often see something visual, something that optically represents the company's vision. And you see this even in the manufacturing context, right? And you see an individual who is literally managing a machine, I've seen this, have a clear idea of how his or her role ladders up to that strategy. But they start there and they know how their work contributes. It can be very powerful. This concept of autonomy. Relatedly, we see great companies here really having individuals and employees take ownership for that innovation. In one organization I went into that is most certainly a people and performance winner, they had thousands of Kaizens, right? Continuous improvement measures every year. And if you talk to an employee, they would say, well, I do a Kaizen because it helps me and my work environment. It is not something that I'm required to do or that my boss will approve, but rather the Kaizen is for me. It's about continuous improvement for me and my role relative to the strategy. And then, of course, the innovation that comes with that, much more what we would call entrepreneurship, collaboration to drive outcomes. So we're going to get a little bit more into this in the panel discussion, but that just would give you a flavor of how these practices, these management practices would play out in an organization context. So of course we think culture it is the game here, and it is the core way to activate human capital. So just to recap what we've heard here today, we see that empirically in the data, there is a real payoff to skill development and setting the context for human capital in a way that activates it over time, and that relates to these management practices. And the data is really compelling, right? We saw that human capital builders actually drive more benefits for themselves as companies, but also they help invest in talent, right, beyond their borders of the company, and that helps human capital accumulation over time. And then finally, we saw that the people and performance winners really have a distinctive signature combination of the management practices that they are emphasizing, and there's a lot to learn from that in terms of how to put that in practice. So with that, we are going to get right into our panel discussion. And we are joined, Claudia got a little bit of an intro before, but I'll embarrass Claudia further and just say, when we were thinking through different people to kind of bring, the people and performance winner concept to life, we immediately thought of Claudia, and you'll see why when she starts talking about how she's done this at Xylem, which is a water technology company, and I'll let Claudia say more about what Xylem does. But Claudia's, she has been the Chief People Officer and Sustainability Officer since 2021. Yes?
Yeah.
Before that was actually General Counsel and Corporate Secretary for Xylem. So she is a CHRO, not by training, but came into the role through a different leadership route. And she is an extremely interesting person. She has a 23-year-old son, who is her focus group of one. Both Katy and Claudia might refer to their focus groups of one during the course of conversation. And Claudia is also just one of an incredibly well-read CHRO who also has a hard practical edge. So with that.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to live up to all of that, okay?
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about Xylem first, and then I'll kick off with the question.
So Xylem is not a household name like McKinsey or Microsoft, and unless you're a water nerd, you probably don't know what we do, okay? So we are a company of about 18,000 colleagues all around the world. In fact, most of our colleagues are located outside of the US. And we are a water technology company. And when you think about okay, what does that mean, okay? I'm gonna make it kind of real and concrete, okay? When you think about the clean water that is in your home, it needs to get there somehow, so it needs to be transported. It needs to have been treated so that it is usable for you. And then when you think about the wastewater in your home, and I know we don't like to think about it, but at Xylem, we actually love wastewater. The wastewater has to get away from your home. So it has to be, transported away. And let me tell you, transporting wastewater is way harder than transporting clean water. And I'll let your imagination do the rest, okay?
Or not.
And it has to be treated, it has to be analyzed in order to be able to be returned to the environment. And so that's what we do, and we really do the technology part. About 50% of our revenues are with public entities, so most of the municipalities provide water, so we work a lot with public entities. And about the rest of the 50% are in the industrial space and the commercial building, a little bit of agriculture, and a little bit of residential. The really exciting thing, and then I'll stop, is we're in the middle of acquiring another water technology company. So it's a really interesting time for the company to think about, when you bring two companies together, how do you think about human capital? So that's a little bit more about Xylem. And I'm happy to go into any level of detail that anybody would like around the water cycle. Okay, I'll
just
do that
don't do
in
it
the
over
breaks.
lunch. Yes. Okay. So thank you, Claudia. The first question I'll have you answer, but Katy would also like to hear your view from the McKinsey perspective as well, which is how do you think about skill development in the Xylem context, and how do you relate that back to the strategy?
Yeah. So in fact, I would say we start with strategy. Okay. So when we think about what skills are needed, and I'll give a very kind of concrete example. One of the areas that where the water sector is really underdeveloped is in the area of using digital tools. So acquiring digital skill set and building digital literacy and capabilities within the organization is absolutely critical. And so we didn't start out, obviously, saying, well, everybody does digital, so we have to. We started out with what are the needs in the water sector? How can we from a strategy execution perspective, where can we add value to our customers and to our communities, and what capabilities do we need to build? Another really good example is when you look at the water sector, predominantly here in the US, but also in Europe, the water sector has an dramatically aging workforce. I mean, the retirement risk in the sector is huge. And it is not very diverse. It doesn't look like the community the sector actually serves. So from another skills perspective, right, thinking about how do we get people that look like our customers into the organization, and then how do we build a culture and an environment that fosters inclusion so that we can have individuals from all sorts of different professional backgrounds, economic backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, language backgrounds is a big deal in our company. I mean, the vast majority of our people, English is their second language. English is my second language, right? So inclusion practices have a really broad lens.
Great, thank you, Claudia. Katy, what about the McKinsey perspective?
I think McKinsey historically has had lots and lots of focus on apprenticeship and development, right? And that's been a hallmark of how we work. But as we have thought about the requirements that our clients really have of us in terms of the kinds of skills we bring to them, and frankly, the diversity of the colleague group that we want to recruit and foster, we've had to challenge some of our paradigms about how we think about development and even skills upon hire. So we are looking quite broadly at kind of our end-to-end skill journeys and really thinking about, first of all, how do we support and celebrate a much more diverse set of skills? How do we ensure that that's not only driven by our strategy, but also is very dynamic to very quickly adapt to changes in the environment, right? We want to immediately celebrate people with Gen AI skills, and we don't want to have to go back into some conference room to write out, a whole career path around Gen AI. It needs to just happen in a very dynamic way. So we're shifting our talent architecture to one that's much more skill-based. And we're also being much more thoughtful about how we recruit. It used to be that we recruited primarily with a McKinsey case study interview. I don't know if any of you failed it like I did. I did very poorly originally and came back to McKinsey many years after that. And it doesn't actually, it identifies some skills, but it actually doesn't identify kind of the intrinsics and the skill for learning. And so we're changing our assessment approach as well.
Great. And when you all looked at those practices, and I can even put them back up, right, for the performance and people winners, what practices stand out? And Claudia, I'll go to you first in terms of, and maybe there's some that are missing too. That would be helpful as well. But when you look at these, what's your reaction? How are they playing out in Xylem?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that really, there were two things that stood out for me. The first one I would say is how critical it is to really make sure that everybody in an organization, especially as organizations have to make decisions in a more dispersed and a much less hierarchical manner than previously, how important it is that everybody in the organization understands, why am I doing today what I'm doing, and how does it connect to what we're trying to do as an enterprise. And so at Xylem, because of the company we are a very mission-based organization. I mean, our motto we talk about is let's solve water, right? So everybody gets that. But that doesn't mean that everybody really understands, well, how do we do that, and how does my job relate to that? And so over the last couple of years, we actually really had to think about very differently what is the role of our senior leaders, so not really the CEO direct reports, but the next layer of senior leaders, and how do we need to train and re-educate that group so that they can become real translators and communicators of strategy and help their teams to then help individual contributors understand, why am I, how do I serve and how do I contribute to the organization? And when we talk about purpose, we often think about the purpose of a company, right? But it's also the purpose at an individual level. Why does my work matter? And so what we actually did is we were very deliberate about assigning some of our executives in a big reorganization that we did to pivot kind of closer to the customer. And we rotated internally 21% of our top leadership. And that was a big shift. And we moved people geographically, we moved people functionally, we moved people from business unit to business unit to build kind of cohesive within the company and to have people understand what the company does for the customers at a much broader level. The other thing we did, and it was not popular, but it was really, but everybody is seeing the benefit now, is we had a leadership group that we met with regularly that was like 500 people. And when you really try to activate and change something, that's just too big a group. And so we dramatically reduced that group and set very different expectations of how that group needs to interact and collaborate together. So on the kind of translating strategy into individual kind of objectives and how we tapped into mid-level management, that was one of the key, I would say, practices that we adopted that really was instrumental.
Yeah. Katy, what about McKinsey?
I think when I read this list, I was struck by how many of these practices we need to reinvent in our modern context. That many of these things I would have been able 5 years ago to tell you kind of what our aspirations were and how we thought about doing this. And so much has changed, both because of technology and because of COVID. So 2 examples, inclusive work environment. We certainly long have figured out that we need to have people with deep expertise and technologists. But I think, like all of you, that technology and expertise now has to infuse everything we do. It can't be kind of separate group over there who does some analytics and supports, the rest of us more traditional, colleagues. And so thinking about what inclusion means and how we actually form teams that are far more diverse in terms of the backgrounds, the skills, the perspectives that they bring has created real challenge in how we think about team formation and how we think about team success and performance. And so really reinventing how we actualize inclusion in the way we work has been something that we've been focused on. Another example is effective on-the-job coaching and training. A lot of our on-the-job coaching and training was informal and in person, all of which went away during COVID. And so how did we, I actually see Heather is here, our Chief Learning and Talent Officer, and she's really reinventing how we think about apprenticeship. How do we become much more purposeful? How do we teach people how to teach others while they work? Because that's not something we can just take for granted because people are all sitting in the same place anymore. It's also got to be reinvented because we no longer can just rely on the senior people, the old people like me, to teach young people coming in the profession. Actually, it's the young people who are the digital natives, and they need to teach, us. So we now have a mantra: everyone a teacher, everyone a learner, every day. And that's a complete reinvention of how we thought about the apprenticeship on the job coaching and training model. So I was really struck by how, in some sense, these are, key practices that are evergreen, but what they really mean and how you make them work in our modern world is changing extremely rapidly.
Yeah.
Can I build maybe
Yes.
on one thing you said, Katy, and that is, the building this culture where the more senior or experienced individuals in the organization learn from the next generation talent coming in. I think that is another area that is incredibly important and where you really have to be purposeful in order to make that happen. Because when you think about in an organization like ours, we are very traditional. I mean, our roots are in a traditional manufacturing setting, right? And in that kind of a setting, that's not a natural thing to happen. So we've actually been very purposeful about thinking through, how does reverse, quote unquote, reverse learning or reverse mentoring, what does that look like? And to get traction with it, we're basically saying everybody at the kind of leadership level in the organization, you go participate and practice in this. And then we feature it in our, kind of virtual town halls, right? So that you have individuals share what they've learned, right? And use that to kind of drive adoption versus necessarily mandating it from the top. But it's incredibly important.
Yeah.
And it links back to what we were talking about with skills, because the only way you can really make that work is if you start focusing on skills versus years of experience.
Yes.
Right, and that's been a huge change for us, trying to get our organization to stop thinking about tenure and start thinking about skills and skill development.
That's been a huge shift, for sure. And actually, Katy, let me just stay with you for a second, because one of the big initiatives that you've been leading is this concept of self-authored journeys. And we saw the word autonomy used on the next page here to really describe not just independence, and this goes back to Dan Pink and what he wrote about in terms of what really motivates an employee, but there's independence associated with that, there's ownership associated with that. Explain to us the notion of self-authored journeys and how that actually plays out here.
Yeah, so one of the key kind of cultural tenets of McKinsey long has been make your own McKinsey, which is you come in and you get to decide how you build your career path over time, and you can change from being, like me, a manufacturing person to a talent person. How fantastic. But to be honest, that was all in the construct of a fairly narrow and homogenous kind of group of colleagues with pretty, relatively similar backgrounds. And so what we've realized, in order to really allow diversity of backgrounds and experience and frankly, life choices to flourish in our firm, we have to change to more of a self-authored, like true flexibility at the level of career path, as opposed to at the level of kind of application of that career path or the program. So one of the things we're doing is we used to send a memo out before any colleague was being reviewed saying, here's what we value. Please tell us how you've done against what we value. And we've changed that on its head. So we now send out something that says, can you please tell us about your professional aspirations? Who do you want to be as a professional and as a leader? What skills have you been working on, and what skills do you need help with? And that's called our leadership growth plan. So we now are reacting to each colleague's leadership growth plan and helping them chart their course.
And Claudia, I want to ask you also a Xylem-specific question, which is you've spent a lot of time thinking about how to match talent to roles, critical roles. And this was actually a topic of conversation at dinner last night, right? Which is, when you think about an organization driving value, there are some roles that have more accountability associated with them. There are some roles that matter more to driving value in an organization. So first of all, would love to hear how you have thought about that, and then how you square that with building an inclusive culture, because I think that was a little bit the debate last night, which is those things seem at odds.
Yeah. So let me try this. Who here in the organization thinks that they do not have a critical role in their organization? Right. So everybody thinks their role in the organization is critical. But when you really think about it, and this is where we started, right? Everybody has their own definition of what is critical, and I'm a leader, therefore I must be critical, right? But we looked at what really is our value agenda. In other words, over the next 3 years, is our value agenda, creating a certain kind of revenue growth in certain geographies? Is it about, driving profitable growth? Is it about expanding our portfolio? What is our value agenda? And from that, we said, okay, now, and it was actually, when we talk about talent, we spent a ton of time talking about and refining as a senior leadership team, which really surprised me on what is our value agenda? What are we really after for the next 3 years, both in terms of the strategies that we need to drive, but also what is the financial outcome, because we are a for-profit enterprise, that we want to deliver for our investors, right? And what we learned was that we were not aligned. And in order to really have an enterprise view on what are the critical roles that drive disproportionate value in your organization, that alignment was absolutely critical. And so before then, we had a group of critical roles that was way too large to manage. And so we used that alignment journey in terms of what is our value agenda over the next 3 years and what are we really after, to hone in on what are the roles that really deliver 80% of that value. And those roles we will manage as an enterprise leadership team. And then we went through the work and said, okay, what do we need those roles to do? Do we have the right talent in that role? do we prioritize when that role is open, that role for actual faster recruitment and talent acquisition? Do we have that role structured right, or do we potentially have too much value in a role, so a role has to be broken up? Or do we have certain strategic objectives that we don't have a role yet for? And what we found is that some of those things existed within Xylem. What we also found is that some of our critical roles, they were not the CEO direct reports or the next level down. In other words, it broke the barrier of always thinking about your critical roles from a hierarchical perspective, but to really look at, where is the value created? And so we have a common language now that allows us to talk, about the value agenda, about, what are the critical roles, and then we get to matching the people to the right roles. And that allowed us to have a very different conversation with data and with a tie to strategy than we've ever had before. I mean, it was one of the game changers for us in terms of how we think about managing talent. Now, you asked me, what does that allow? Now, does that mean that, and we came up with roughly 70 roles. For an enterprise, we're a $5.5 billion enterprise with 18,000 colleagues, right? What about the 17,000, and nearly 18,000 colleagues that are not critical roles, right? Are they suddenly no longer important? And so, that is a journey we're on because we had to, because it is not that easy to explain unless you're part of that journey, that it is the value agenda that drives the critical roles. And that doesn't mean that other roles are not important. Because when you think, I always think of a company as a village, right? You need all sorts of skills and all sorts of roles to make a village successful. And the same is true for a company, but that doesn't mean that, there aren't roles that deliver 80% or thereabouts of your value agenda.
So I'm sure there's a question in the audience about that one. So I'm going to ask one last question, then I will open it up for questions from you all. And the question I want to ask is, Claudia, you actually mentioned earlier in our discussion the role of the middle manager. And this came up at dinner, and I was reflecting on this even yesterday during the performance that Stephen led, which is, how do you activate the middle manager, the quintessential middle manager, as a people and performance leader? And I think we've seen an increased focus on this kind of layer of the organization as you think about translating strategy into role-specific implications. How have you both thought about that? Any advice to give, lessons learned from specifically on the role of the middle manager? Maybe Katy, I'll go to you first, and then Claudia.
Yeah, I do think that our world now has put a real focus on the skills and the the levers that middle management can pull and need to exercise, because they now face a much broader set of options around how to think about building purpose and energy and alignment and productivity in their teams. I think one of the things that COVID and the whole virtual work situation has put a real focus on is the fact that we have really terrible measures of productivity for knowledge workers. And so this is why a lot of senior leaders just desperately want people back in the office so they can watch them work, which of course is not at all tied to productivity. So it really means that frontline supervisors, frontline managers have to be much more thoughtful about making good decisions. I think most of us see that these policies of be in the office a certain number of days a week are not working because they don't actually take advantage of the kinds of activities that in-person it actually is better for. So you actually have to plan your days differently. You have to plan when you're together and why you're together and how you will be together. You have to manage productivity when you're not together in a way that's different from what you did before. And so that's a whole new skill set. I think it's actually quite exciting, but it is a whole new skill set for our middle managers.
Yeah. Claudia, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of debates over, including with our board, who is, composed of members of truly a different generation, right? And they were like, Claudia, you got to tell people to show back up in the office. And I said, no. I said, what we have to do is we have to create a framework that says, we are open to making sure that we work in ways that work in your geography and that work on your team and in your group. And so that's really the conversation we also had yesterday at dinner. And that is hard. So I will tell you, when I look at, for example, our teams in China and our teams in India, they are spending way more time back in the office because their home environments, their connectivity is a completely different setup than what we have in many parts of the US. We are a manufacturing company, so a lot of our teams have to be on site. For knowledge workers, we've basically said to our managers, you go figure it out. We've trained our HR business partners to understand what questions to ask and kind of how to try to get at, what is the right amount of time for this team to spend time together. And given that I was a lawyer in my prior life, right, lawyers spend a lot of time on their own. And that's okay, and that doesn't undermine their productivity. But when you're kind of thinking through from a product management perspective, how do you kind of curate a great customer journey? Like, that's not individual work, so you have to really be purposeful about bringing people together, and the best people to make those decisions are your middle managers. And it's incredibly hard. They were all unhappy, I can tell you that. They're like, no, Claudia, tell us. And I said, no, this is about understanding what your team needs and really engaging in a conversation around, how are we effective as a team? What skills do we need? And what level of diversity do we have on our team where, somebody might be, a working parent or is giving, a caregiver for their aging parent, and driving 3 hours every single day is going to undermine their productivity, not add to it.
Right.
So seeing the whole person,
Yeah.
which is a very new concept for many traditional middle managers.
Yeah, it is. And it requires judgment.
Yes, it does, a lot.
Yes.
And the willingness to make a mistake and then say, you know what, I made a mistake. We got to be more in the office because, we're not producing as much as I thought we would. And that's also okay.
Yeah, that adaptability. All right, we'd love to hear from you all in terms of questions on your mind for Katy and Claudia. And I'm sure, yes, so we have some mics kind of roaming around. Great. A couple down here.
Thank you so much. This has been a very insightful, and my wheels are turning. I'm on a similar journey, Claudia, around thinking about our middle management, and we have a very, like you talked about your journey around the 500, that you reduced the number of people who had, and you reset their expectations around their responsibility to connect to the strategy, and then also you said you reset their expectations around how they connected with each other. Could you double click on that?
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that, and I will be the first to say, it's a journey. It's not like you switch. I mean, we all know this about human behavior, right? We don't switch on a flip. Flip a switch and then it happens, right? So first of all, it took a bit of convincing, right? Because we are a very collaborative culture. That's kind of our DNA. And so when I first proposed this concept, everybody's like, no, Claudia, like you're going to alienate 450 of our leaders. And I said, I'm going to activate 150 of our leaders, okay? And the advantage that we had is that a lot of the individuals in that leadership group, I would say about 75% of them had gone through our executive development program, which is a cohort-based program that we have had, on a very kind of focused basis for about 10 years. And so it was a group that, except for individuals that were new to the organization, that knew each other reasonably well. And so one of the things that I did to kind of activate their interaction is to tap into their shared experience in that executive development program, okay? So that was number one. Number two, we have a team site, and there's interaction in between kind of our monthly get-togethers for that group, and there is pre-reading, and we get together on, everybody can talk, right? It's not the senior leadership team gets on these sessions and talks at that group, right? But rather, for example, in terms of activating the strategic narrative, right, we're having a number of people from that group share how they have activated it with their groups, right? Because a lot of times, the peer learning and peer sharing is incredibly powerful, way more powerful than senior leaders talking, right? So that's one thing. When we do employee surveys, which we do as pulse surveys, right? We have individuals from that group share how they have activated and what they have done, and also where they have made asked of what they need from senior leadership, right? So a lot of times from lots of acquisitions, industrial companies, systems are a big issue, right? So there are certain things in terms of harmonizing systems where escalation and investment asks are being made. And that's all surfaced up through that group, And then if I come back in next year, I can probably share more in terms of additional things. But that's how we've begun that journey.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Claudia.
You're welcome.
I think there's.
Hey, Brooke, thank you. I'm curious about the difference. I've heard from both of you relying on an existing infrastructure of people who were enculturated or grown up in the company. And we've had this huge hiring wave through pandemic where people were virtually onboarded and built relationships through Slack. And there's a big difference in terms of how those folks view the culture. So how do you, as you're talking about this journey, how do we accelerate or think about bringing that population into the fold, for want of a better way to?
This has been a big focus for us, and I don't think we've totally cracked the code, but this whole notion of how do we accelerate apprenticeship and onboarding for colleagues who may not have met many people, and how do we ensure that they're really developing the networks that they need to be successful, that they understand kind of ways of working. One of the things we had done, luckily, before the pandemic is to codify kind of our team operating model into something we call the way we work, which has a set of specific rituals and also has a whole set of analytics around it, which has been very helpful because at least we have something that isn't just kind of passed down from generation to generation, which is what we had before. It was a very, very strong working model and culture, but it was not written down. Now it is something that's much more formalized, so that we're using that, and we've also developed a set of online and in-person kind of learning modules that are meant to accelerate the apprenticeship of these colleagues who've come in, but it's a real challenge for sure.
Yeah. Claudia, do you want to?
So let me just maybe build on that. Clearly, it's a challenge, and it's a focus area for us. One of the things that we are doing for those of our new folks that we're bringing in that are knowledge workers, so that are basically wired and work on computers, we bring them together in monthly cohorts, and again, we're leveraging teams to have them connect as we are the new people, and so there's a new people group, and then after a certain period of time, you get migrated off that group. And then we are quite purposeful in terms of bringing people together that are new over the first kind of 3 months in, again, kind of cohorts, but regionally attached to one of our major, manufacturing or office sites that we have. But we are much more intentional about it. And like Katy said, we haven't cracked the code yet either. But it's, I think, something that all organizations with everybody onboarded virtually, it's different, and to kind of create the sense of belonging, the need for purposeful curation is, I think, completely different than it was pre-COVID.
Well, one of the things I'm very aware of is that we've created a lot of focus around bringing senior leaders together. Our partner meetings are back in person, our new partner, orientation back in person, our personnel committees, and yet it's actually these newer, younger colleagues that we really need to bring together. And so one of the things we're tracking, we track co-location, and we're measuring kind of the impact of co-location. And by the way, we're finding that being 50% co-located over time has great impact around job satisfaction, retention, but also performance, mentorship, development, et cetera. One of the things that I'm worried about is starting to track that senior people are getting back together and they're not bringing the young people along. And so that's something that we're really focused on.
Great, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you talk a little more about, once you've identified the 70 roles, those critical roles, how are you treating the individuals in those roles differently and the roles themselves? Is there something happening around succession planning that's different for those roles than the non-critical roles?
Yes, yes, and yes. So let me
And do you tell the people they're in a critical role as well?
So that is a really great question, okay? And it was something that we debated, okay? And so for us, in terms of where we are in our journey with this process and with kind of transparency around talent and compensation in general, we have decided that we would not tell individuals, okay? So the critical roles are enterprise roles that are known to, senior HR leaders and the senior part of the organization, and it is that part of the organization that is responsible for managing the roles and the talent. So in terms of how we think about the roles, we prioritize them for recruitment. We make sure that that they are resourced appropriate, so what we expect those roles to do in terms of their accountabilities for the next 3 years, that they're resourced to actually be able to execute on that, because they're such an important part of our value agenda. We are spending much more time on what does the succession pipeline look like, and also the pipeline candidates, where are their experience and skill gaps, and what can we do today to secure and build up that pipeline, okay? And that's really what we're doing. Does that address your question? Perfect.
I really appreciated, I'm over here. Hey. It's like the big coming of Christ, right? Yeah. I really appreciated the fact that you said that you started with strategy, and I think many companies get that intuitively. But there's starting with strategy and there's strategic clarity. I would love to get a little bit of more texture, how you got to the clarity that is really necessary to get to the 20% that drives the 80%. That's where that magic happens. And in that process, not only I'm curious, were you clear on who you are, but also as clear on who you are not?
So Greg, all of these are great questions. And let me maybe just say that it was messy, okay? And it required actually more candid conversation around what are our priorities and what are we not going to invest in. That was very helpful, because when you think about, right, at the end of the day, strategy is all about selecting some stuff and deselecting a whole lot of stuff, right? And so even though it was a talent exercise, the way we kind of framed it for the senior leadership from a conversation, we probably spent, 60 to 70% on honing in on what is our strategy, and where are we going to invest in, both in terms of financial capital and human capital. And I don't think in the absence of that effort, we would have, it really was an accelerator to strategic clarity, as ironic as that sounds, and we've then been able to take that work, and it wasn't perfect by any means, but and we will do another iteration on it. I mentioned earlier that we're in the middle of a big acquisition, right? And big transformative transactions or events in companies and organizations' history are always moments to say, okay, let me pause, observe, and kind of be mindful here in terms of what does the next step look like, right? So we are going to be using the work that we've done, as we come together with two companies to say, okay, what are the critical roles now? Because now that we're combined, our value agenda has pivoted a little bit. And so we're building on the muscle that we exercised, okay? And I can tell you that there was not all agreement. In fact, our CEO initially had a different value agenda than the rest of, of us, which was very interesting because it laid open that we're not aligned as a senior team, and therefore, if you're not aligned as a senior team, you have there's no way you can drive, strategy activation within the organization.
Well, on that note, thank you, Katy. Thank you, Claudia. You guys are awesome. And look forward to continuing the discussion with all of you throughout the day. Thank you.